Hi friends, welcome back to Talevora. Before Martin Luther King Jr. became one of the most powerful voices for equality in America, he was just a young boy growing up in a world where the color of his skin could decide where he could go, what he could do, and how others treated him. But as he grew older, he decided that he could not simply accept that world. His journey would take him from a young preacher to a national leader, facing hatred, arrests, threats, and violence while refusing to give up on his belief in change. This is the true story of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s story began on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, at a time when America was deeply divided by race. He was born into a family where faith, education, and community service were important parts of everyday life. His father was a Baptist pastor, and from an early age, Martin grew up surrounded by the church and the powerful language of preaching. But outside his home and church, he was growing up in a country where Black Americans were treated differently simply because of the color of their skin. In the American South, racial segregation was part of everyday life. Black and white people could be forced to use separate schools, restaurants, waiting rooms, bathrooms, and other public facilities. For a young Martin, these realities gradually became impossible to ignore. As a child, he experienced moments that showed him how deeply racism had entered ordinary life. He remembered friendships being affected by racial boundaries, and he saw how Black families could be denied opportunities that white families took for granted. These experiences did not immediately turn him into a political leader. He was simply a young boy trying to understand why the world around him seemed so unfair. As Martin grew older, education became one of the most important parts of his life. He was an intelligent and serious student, and he moved quickly through his education. He attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, where he studied sociology and began thinking more deeply about religion, society, and the problems facing Black Americans. At first, King was not certain that becoming a pastor was the path he wanted, but the more he studied and thought about his faith, the more he began to see the ministry as a way to serve people and confront injustice. He eventually entered theological education and earned a doctorate in systematic theology from Boston University. During his years in Boston, his world expanded beyond the South. He met people from different backgrounds, studied philosophy and theology, and became increasingly interested in the ideas of nonviolent resistance. He was particularly influenced by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, whose movement in India had demonstrated that organized nonviolent resistance could challenge a powerful system without relying on violence. These ideas would later become central to King's own approach. In 1954, King became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He was only 25 years old. Montgomery looked very different from Boston. The racial system was deeply established, and Black residents faced discrimination in almost every part of daily life. King had arrived to preach, lead his congregation, and build a life with his wife, Coretta Scott King. He could not have known how quickly his life was about to change. On December 1, 1955, a Black woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery bus. She was arrested. The incident became the spark for a much larger protest. Black residents of Montgomery organized a boycott of the city's bus system. They wanted an end to segregated seating and the humiliating treatment they experienced on public transportation. Local leaders needed someone who could help unite the community, and the young pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church became one of the central figures. King was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. He was still only 26 years old. Suddenly, a man who had spent most of his life studying and preaching, found himself at the center of a major civil rights struggle. The boycott was supposed to be a protest against an unfair bus system, but it quickly became much bigger. For more than a year, thousands of black residents refused to use Montgomery buses. They walked long distances. They organized carpools. They faced pressure and intimidation. King himself became a target. His home was bombed in January 1956 while his wife and young daughter were inside. Fortunately, they survived. When King arrived at his damaged home and saw the crowd gathered outside, emotions were high. Some people wanted revenge. They were angry and frightened, but King urged them not to respond with violence. He told his supporters that their movement had to remain disciplined and nonviolent. It was one of the moments that revealed what kind of leader he intended to become. King understood that anger was natural, but he believed anger could be transformed into organized action. The Montgomery boycott continued month after month. King and other leaders faced arrests, threats, harassment, and financial pressure, but the protesters refused to give up. Eventually, the legal battle reached the federal courts, and in November 1956, the Supreme Court upheld a ruling that segregation on Montgomery buses was unconstitutional. The boycott ended in December 1956 after more than a year. The victory transformed King's life. He had entered the struggle as a relatively unknown young pastor. He emerged as a national civil rights leader. But Montgomery had also taught him something important. A single protest could challenge an entire system when ordinary people organized together. And King now understood that the problem was much larger than one city's buses. Across the American South, segregation remained deeply rooted. Schools were separated. Restaurants refused to serve black customers. Voting rights were restricted. Violence and intimidation were used to maintain the racial order. King knew that Montgomery was only the beginning. In 1957, he helped establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization created to coordinate nonviolent civil rights campaigns across the South. He became its first president. His life was changing rapidly. He traveled constantly, giving speeches and helping communities organize. The quiet young pastor who had once wondered about his future was now becoming the voice of a movement. But the more powerful his voice became, the more dangerous his life became. He received threatening letters. He faced arrests. He was watched by authorities. Yet he continued traveling from city to city, preaching and organizing. His message was not simply about defeating white people. King repeatedly spoke about equality, justice, dignity, and the possibility of changing American society without destroying it through hatred. He believed that the people participating in the movement had to resist injustice without becoming consumed by the same hatred they were fighting against. That philosophy would soon be tested on a much larger scale. The Montgomery victory had made Martin Luther King Jr. famous, but it had also placed a much heavier responsibility on his shoulders. He was no longer simply a pastor serving one congregation. People across the South were beginning to look toward him whenever they wanted to challenge racial injustice. King understood that fame could help the movement, but he also knew that fame could become a dangerous distraction. His goal was not to become a celebrity. He wanted to build a movement strong enough to change the system that had kept millions of black Americans unequal for generations. In the years that followed, protests began appearing in different parts of the South. One of the most important developments came from young black students who were willing to put themselves directly into situations where they knew they might face insults, arrests, or violence. In 1960, for black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat at a whites-only lunch counter at a Woolworth store and refused to leave. Their action inspired similar sit-ins across the country. Young people were becoming an important force in the movement. King supported their courage, but he also understood how dangerous direct confrontation could become. The movement depended on discipline. Protesters were trained to remain peaceful even when people shouted at them, pushed them, or attacked them. This was not weakness. It required extraordinary self-control. By 1961, civil rights activists were also challenging segregation in interstate bus travel. Groups known as Freedom Riders boarded buses and traveled through the South to test whether federal laws against segregation were actually being enforced. Their journeys quickly became dangerous. In Alabama, buses were attacked and one was set on fire. Riders were beaten by angry crowds. The violence shocked the country. Yet the Freedom Riders continued. Their courage helped force the federal government to take stronger action against segregation in interstate transportation. King was becoming increasingly convinced that peaceful protest could expose injustice in a way that violence could not. When peaceful demonstrators were attacked, the images could reach audiences far beyond the local community. Television was becoming an increasingly powerful part of American life, and scenes of protesters being beaten or attacked could no longer remain hidden. The struggle moved into Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963. Birmingham was one of the most segregated cities in America, and civil rights activists decided to challenge the city's system directly. King and his organization launched a campaign of demonstrations, boycotts, marches, and civil disobedience. The authorities responded aggressively. Police arrested protesters, including King himself. During his imprisonment, King wrote what became one of his most famous pieces of writing, a letter defending the need for nonviolent direct action. He explained why waiting for a convenient time was not enough for people who had been living under injustice for generations. Outside the jail, the movement continued. One of the most powerful moments came when young people joined the demonstrations. Police used high-pressure water hoses and police dogs against protesters. The images were disturbing. Children and teenagers were knocked down and attacked simply for participating in demonstrations. Those scenes reached audiences across America and around the world. The violence created enormous pressure on political leaders. Birmingham eventually became a turning point. Businesses began negotiating, segregationist policies were challenged, and the national civil rights movement gained even greater momentum. But King knew that one victory would not be enough. The movement needed federal legislation that would make discrimination illegal across the country. That same year, King helped organize the March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Washington, D.C. They came together to demand jobs, freedom, and civil rights. King stood before the crowd at the Lincoln Memorial and delivered the speech that would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. He spoke about his dream of a country where people would not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. The speech transformed him into an international symbol of the struggle for equality. But behind the famous words was a man who knew that the fight was far from finished. Racism had not disappeared because of one speech. Black Americans still faced discrimination, poverty, voter suppression, and violence. King continued traveling and organizing. He pushed for the Civil Rights Act, which was signed into law in 1964. The law prohibited discrimination in important areas of American public life and represented one of the biggest legal victories of the civil rights movement. That same year, King received the Nobel Peace Prize. He was only 35 years old. The award made him one of the youngest people ever to to receive the prize at that time. King donated the prize money to the civil rights movement. But even as his international reputation grew, his personal life remained under enormous pressure. His family lived with threats and uncertainty. Coretta Scott King supported him through years of constant travel, public pressure, and danger. Their children grew up knowing that their father was a famous leader, but they also saw the risks that came with his work. King himself was exhausted at times. He had been arrested repeatedly, threatened with death, physically attacked, and placed under intense surveillance. Yet he continued. He also began looking beyond racial segregation itself. He became increasingly concerned about poverty and economic inequality. King understood that legal equality did not automatically mean economic equality. A person could have the right to vote and still be unable to find decent work or afford a home. He began talking more about poor people, workers, and the economic structures that kept families trapped in poverty. His vision was becoming broader. He wanted America to confront not only racism but also poverty and inequality. Then another issue began to divide the country. The United States was fighting the Vietnam War, and King became increasingly critical of American involvement. In 1967, he delivered a major speech in which he openly opposed the war. Some people who had supported him were uncomfortable with his position. They believed he was moving beyond civil rights and entering an area that could damage his political influence. But King refused to remain silent simply because his opinion was unpopular. He believed that if he spoke about justice, he could not ignore suffering caused by war. His decision came with a price. Critics attacked him. Some newspapers questioned his judgment. Even people within the civil rights movement worried about the direction he was taking. But King continued speaking. By this point, he was no longer simply demanding that Black Americans be allowed to sit at the same lunch counters or vote without discrimination. He was questioning the deeper problems of American society. He wanted a country where people had genuine opportunities, where poverty was taken seriously, and where violence did not determine the future. In 1968, he began preparing for another major campaign. This time, his attention was focused heavily on economic justice. He planned a poor people's campaign that would bring people from different backgrounds to Washington, D.C. They would demand jobs, housing, and economic opportunity. But before the campaign could fully develop, King traveled to Memphis, Tennessee. Sanitation workers there were on strike, demanding better wages, safer working conditions, and recognition of their union. King went to Memphis to support them. He understood their struggle as part of the larger fight for dignity. On March 18, 1968, he spoke to thousands of people in Memphis and promised to return. A few weeks later, he did exactly that, but he would never leave Memphis alive. On the evening of April 3, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. stood before a crowd at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. He had come to support the city's striking sanitation workers, but the speech he gave that night would become one of the final speeches of his life. King spoke about the struggle, the danger, and the uncertainty surrounding the movement. He knew that the road ahead could be difficult, yet he also told the people listening that he was not afraid of what might happen to him. The following day, April 4, King spent time at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. He was staying there with members of his team. The atmosphere was calm compared with the protests and demonstrations that had filled his life for so many years. King was preparing to go to dinner with friends and colleagues. He stepped outside onto the balcony of the motel. At approximately 6:01 in the evening, a gunman fired a shot from a nearby building. King was struck and seriously wounded. His colleagues rushed to help him. Emergency workers arrived, and he was taken to St. Joseph's Hospital, but his injuries were too severe. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead that evening. He was 39 years old. The news spread across America with extraordinary speed. For people who had followed his journey from Montgomery to Birmingham, Washington, and Memphis, his death was almost impossible to understand. The man who had spent years preaching nonviolence had been killed by an act of violence. Cities across America erupted in grief, anger, and unrest. More than 100 cities experienced disturbances following the assassination. For many people, King's death felt like the loss of a leader who had given them hope that America could become something better. But the story did not end with his death. The movement he had helped build continued. The Civil Rights Act had already changed federal law, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had provided important protections for Black voters. King's work had helped push the country toward major changes, but the struggle for equality was far from over. His assassination also changed the way millions of people remembered him. The young pastor who had once stood before a small congregation had become an international symbol of peaceful resistance and the fight against racial injustice. But reducing his life to one famous speech would mean missing the complexity of his journey. King was not simply a man who gave speeches. He was a husband, a father, a pastor, an organizer, and a person who lived under enormous pressure. He made difficult decisions, faced criticism, and sometimes had to choose between remaining popular and saying what he believed was right. He also understood that nonviolence was not passive. It demanded courage. Protesters had to be willing to face arrest, humiliation, physical attacks, and sometimes death without responding with revenge. King believed that this discipline could expose injustice while giving society a chance to change. His approach was deeply connected to his Christian faith, but his message about dignity and justice reached far beyond the walls of churches. People from different backgrounds could see themselves in the struggle he described. His influence also extended beyond America. His speeches and methods became examples for people around the world who were interested in peaceful resistance and social change. At the same time, his legacy is not without debate. King himself changed over time. His ideas became broader as he moved from challenging segregation to confronting poverty, economic inequality, and war. Some Americans who had supported his earlier civil rights campaigns became uncomfortable when he criticized the Vietnam War or demanded deeper economic changes. But that evolution was part of his story. He was not frozen in the moment of the "I have a dream" speech. He continued thinking about what equality actually meant. For King, legal rights were only one part of freedom. A person could technically have rights and still live in poverty, face discrimination, or lack genuine opportunities. That is why his later work became increasingly focused on economic justice. He wanted to bring poor people of different races together and pressure the government to address poverty. His plans were unfinished when he died. The Poor People's Campaign continued after his assassination, but it could never fully replace the leader who had imagined it. Years passed, and the image of King became part of American history. Streets, schools, buildings, and public spaces were named after him. His birthday eventually became a federal holiday in the United States. His words became part of school lessons and public ceremonies. But behind all those memorials was the story of a man who had lived through an America very different from the one many people know today. He grew up under segregation and died while still fighting for a more equal society. His story also shows that social change rarely happens because of one person alone. Thousands of ordinary people marched, boycotted, organized, donated money, provided transportation, went to jail, faced threats, and continued protesting when it would have been easier to stay home. King became the most recognizable voice of the movement, but the movement itself belonged to millions of people. That is one of the most important parts of his story. Martin Luther King Jr. did not single-handedly end racism in America. He did not create equality by himself. What he did was help give a huge movement a powerful voice, a clear moral message, and a strategy based on organized nonviolent action. His life was short, but the impact of those years was enormous. When people remember him today, they often remember the dream he described in Washington. But his story began long before that famous moment. It began with a child growing up in Atlanta, watching the world around him and learning that people could be treated differently because of their race. It continued with a young student searching for answers, a pastor discovering his purpose, and a 26-year-old preacher unexpectedly becoming the face of a national movement. He faced bombs, arrests, threats, surveillance, criticism, exhaustion, and eventually an assassin's bullet. Yet he continued speaking about a future he would never live to see. And perhaps that is what makes his story so powerful. King did not know whether his dream would become reality. He knew the movement could fail. He knew that people could be hurt. He knew that the people fighting for change could become exhausted. But he continued because he believed that injustice should never be accepted simply because it had existed for a long time. His story is ultimately not just about America, politics, or civil rights. It is about what one human being can do when he decides that silence is no longer acceptable. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Christian pastor, a husband, a father, and a civil rights leader. He was also a human being who lived with fear and pressure just like anyone else. What made his story extraordinary was not that he was never afraid. It was that he continued moving forward despite the danger. His life ended on a balcony in Memphis in 1968, but the questions he raised did not end with him. What does equality really mean? How should people respond to injustice? Can hatred be defeated without creating more hatred? And can a society change when ordinary people refuse to accept an unfair system? Those questions remain part of his legacy. More than half a century after his death,